Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We are ready for lesson number 4 in the JLI, the world of Kabbalah. So just to reiterate, the first class, we talked about the 3 worlds, which represents thought, speech, and action. The second class, we spoke about the emanation of the Shvirot as they are in the world of Atzilut. I'm just giving you very quick. And last week, we spoke on a much deeper level, which transcends even Atzilut, which goes into the desire and so on and so forth. Now, we're going to go into something which is actually a standalone class, even if you didn't have any of the 3 classes before, although what you learned before helps. So we will show you where it is. But in order to get the class started, I need you to do an exercise, and that's both for the people that are listening online and for the people that are here. Please open up your books, and if you are on page 111, this is not something that I need to know. This is something you need to know. And there is a series of questions here, and the answers are only yes or no. You're like in court right now. We need no explanations, just yes or no. And after you go through all the questions, be as honest as possible with yourself. Then we will begin the class.
Could you please repeat the page?
The page is 111.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, 111. Tell me when you're done. These are not scientific questions. These are honest questions. Now, I have some questions for you, and they're up on the board. Question number 1. Did you find it difficult to give a definitive answer to these questions?
Yes. No.
Yes, no, okay. No. Question number 2. Do you find yourself giving contradictory yes answers to 2 opposing statements?
Yes. Yeah.
Some of them. That's okay. We're not asking you what. This is not a place for confessions. This is just to get us to understand that we have 2 competing drives within us. And this is very important in order to understand that even those of you that already were exposed to the material, but the way we present the material tonight is unlike anything that we've done until now. This is totally different. So the truth of the matter is that when you see in the questions, we come to the answers that there is an aspiration to be great, but there's also a reality that sometimes we're not great. We want to be selfless, but we realize at times that we're selfish. And it expresses itself in all these ways. So where does it come from? It comes from something that is very important for us to understand as human beings. That as human beings, we're complex creatures. On the one hand, we're altruistic, spiritual, and connected to God. On the other hand, we have selfish drives and hedonistic instincts. This is the fact of who we are. So let's see how it's expressed in the Tanya. So for that, I'm going to ask you to turn to page 112. One other lesson note that I have to share with you. It starts light, but it's going to get heavy. It's like a hike. You know, when you go with an instructor on a hike, and it says in the beginning it's light and then it's moderate. And at one point he says it's going to get a little challenging and then it's going to straighten out. So I'm telling you right now, even though the material at the beginning might sound very simple, we're going to get to a section which is really going to demand us to think and understand and contemplate. But once you get that point, it will explain myriads of things in life. And this has to do with the step above Atzilut and Keter that we talked about until now. So let's give a look in text 112. This is taken out of the famous book known as the Tanya, which was written by Rabbi Shner Zalman of Leadi, and he writes the following. He says the following: every one of us has two souls. The first of our souls originates in non-holiness. This soul resides in our bloodstream to vitalize our body. It is the source of all negative character traits, as well as those positive traits that come naturally to us, such as compassion and kindness. That is the soul number one. In the vernacular of the Tanya, it is referred to as the animal soul, as we will soon see. It's the animalistic side. Now, animalistic side doesn't necessarily mean a negative. You have a lot of animals that are very kind. You have a lot of animals that are very loving. Animal means that it's a natural instinct. So therefore, in some people, the animal side can reveal within us negative character traits, like selfishness or meanness. In some cases, it can even create positive traits. But if these positive traits are our nature, they're still animalistic. So being kind-natured does not necessarily mean being godly. You can't be godly without being kind-natured, but kind-natured could be that that's our nature. That is all stemming from the animal soul, which is the first soul. The reason it's called the first soul is because that's the first soul that enters our body, and children have it until they become bar bat mitzvah, even though children have innocence, but children are basically selfish. Have you ever seen a child cry because they're hungry? Yes. Have you ever seen a child cry because another kid is hungry? It doesn't exist, right? A child is at that level where everything is about themselves, right? As you mature, that's when the divine soul comes in. The divine soul is totally different. Let's give a look. The very last line is a Jew's second soul, and this is true by any human being that ever writes. But the way the Alter Rebbe is speaking to the Jewish people, he says a Jew's second soul is an actual part of the transcendent God. So let's talk about the distinction between the two. The nature, if you give a look on the board, the nature of the Nefesh HaBahamit is uniquely human. In other words, it only deals with human needs. It's all about survival and physical needs. It's also about gratification. And even if it has positive traits, it's self-oriented. It can also sometimes lead to immoral behavior because since the center is myself, so therefore, sometimes it could be immoral. Immorality usually comes from selfishness. So what defines the animal soul is our consciousness of our own self. We need to survive. We need to have, what does this mean to me? What does life mean to me? How am I enjoying my life? How am I enjoying my job? Is the food taste good or not? That's what the Nefesh HaBahamis is. Social media is like that too. Nobody writes on social media that they went to shul and they were inspired and they really loved being one with God. But they'll write on social media that they went to a good restaurant and the steak was great, because that's where our drive is. Our drive is all about ourselves. That is the Nefesh HaBahamit, okay? So Nefesh HaBahamit doesn't necessarily mean always bad. You can even have a philanthropist that loves giving charity, loves helping people, but it comes from their animal soul. Doesn't mean it comes from the divine soul. So that's number one. But the Nefesh HaBahamit at its worst is when it's selfish. Because if the kindness that you do is only because of self-gratification, when you're tested and that kindness is not going to be to your self-gratification, you're not going to do the kindness. Because at the end of the day, you're only doing the kindness because you're interested in gratifying yourself. He said, this charity resonates with me. That charity doesn't. So that's all coming from the Nefesh HaBahamit. So again, it's called Nefesh HaBahamit. You'll see in the Hebrew also it says Nefesh HaBahamit. This is the animal soul. It's the human soul, but what's its definition? It's self-oriented. Now, once someone is self-oriented, it can trigger immoral behavior, because immoral behavior means a child is definitely that. A child, you take away their toy, the world is destroyed. Or if they see another child has a better toy than them, they want to grab it, it's mine. adults can act this way as well. You see somebody else has a nicer car, you become jealous. You say, I'm going to work hard so I can also have that car. That is all self-oriented. Sometimes it could lead to immorality, that you cheat in business, or it could be immorality that you double-cross another person so you can actually gain what you want. That is all considered to be nefesh habahamis. What is nefesh elokit? The nefesh elokit is something else. Nefesh elokit is all God consciousness. It doesn't think about itself. Nefesh elokit doesn't think that it exists. It only recognizes God. So the first thing it wants is a relationship with God. What does it mean it wants a relationship with God? It wants to be one with its source. It recognizes that in it itself is nothing. It's only a reflection of the divine, and it wants to be part of the divine. Another thing is a nefesh elokis wants to have a relationship with other souls, not with other bodies, with other souls. It's a very big difference. They want to connect with other spiritualists to gain from them. A nefesh elokis always realizes how little they know, and going to other people, they can gain from them. They don't have an ego. Nefesh elokis is egoless, so they can learn from every person. Another thing that the nefesh elokis thinks about is it thinks about to fulfill its mission. God gave me a mission. That's what I'm obsessed about, not about what it's me. What do I get out of it? What does God want me for? And that brings us to the final point, to focus what it's needed for. So if you look at the nefesh elokis and nefesh habahamis, they're polar opposites. Nefesh habahamis is like an animal. What is the animal? The animal is always worried about food, and it's walking on all four, trying to find food, trying to survive. The nefesh elokis is always its spirit upwards. It's trying to recognize that there's something much deeper there. Now, in all honesty, which of these two is stronger, the nefesh habahamis or the nefesh elokis? Yeah. Right. I'm not talking about which is more valuable. I'm saying which is stronger. The nefesh habahamis. Why is the nefesh habahamis stronger? And that's what we're going to get to discuss, because this is going to give us an insight to understand the challenges that we face in this physical world, the challenges between good and evil, light and dark, the challenges in our own lives, and the challenges that we've had through all the generations. It's all compacted in one thing. So let's give a look at a statement. It's called The Power of the Beast, text number 2, page 113. There's a pasuk, a verse in Proverbs that says, "V'rav tvot b'koach shor," which means the ox strength produces abundant crops. The literal, simple translation of this means, how did they plow in the olden days? So you can plow with a lamb, with a cow, but if you had a strong ox, you really were able to plow, and then it would produce more wheat, it would produce more crops. The previous Rebbe says that there's a deeper meaning, and that is the animal's soul drive is more potent than the godly soul drive. We're soon going to get to the why. The author of this course was recording a story for us, and he said that you think about it, he was walking in the park on Sukkot, and it was raining. And he was thinking, are we supposed to eat in the sukkah or not? Now, Chabad has this crazy custom that we eat in the sukkah even if it rains. Halachically, you're exempt. And as he was going through this idea in his mind, he goes through the park and he sees a group of men playing soccer in the rain. So he's saying to himself, why are they playing soccer in the rain? Because it was a scheduled game. And they don't care if it's rained out or not. Now, soccer, is that a nefesh habahamid activity, or is it a nefesh elokit activity? It's a nefesh habahamid activity. Eating in the sukkah, is that a nefesh habahamid or a nefesh elokit? It's a godly thing. So there's much more power and persuasion in the physical. Another example, football is a very big sport that everybody goes crazy about. I don't necessarily know. I've only been to a football stadium in one time in my life. Didn't understand what was going on. I was together with Brad, and I told him that now I understand how some people from other Jewish denominations feel in an Orthodox synagogue. They don't know what's going on. I had no idea what was going on. Okay? But people, let's say people in in Wisconsin. We'll go to, what's the team that plays in Wisconsin? The Green Bay Packers. Sometimes they play in what kind of degrees? 1, 2 degrees. Is the stadium packed? Absolutely. They're cheering on. The cold, they'll dress themselves up. Now, go tell them we're going to have an outdoor class on Kabbalah. How many people will come in that kind of temperature? Very few. Okay, you get my point. The point of the matter is that the drive for the physical is much greater than the drive for the spiritual. So the question is, why is it if the divine is the power of God, so then the power of God should be stronger than the power of the physical? Another example that I want to give you. We learned until now that the soul is part of God, and the soul originates in Atzilut. We said the pasuk, God, the soul that you give me, she is pure. That's the world of Atzilut, and it acclimates through the 3 worlds until it comes into our body. So what happens? If the soul comes into our body should become totally subservient to the soul. An example, it says in Proverbs that the candle of God is the soul of the human, or the soul of the human is the candle of God. Take a wax candle, light a candle with a fire, that's the soul. What happens to the wax? It melts. And yet in our experience, the soul comes into the body, and what happens? The soul is shut down. It's suppressed. And what takes the center stage? The body and all of the bodily needs. The only part of the soul that is present is the fact that we're alive. But that's not the essence of the soul. The essence of the soul is the nefesh elokit, is the godly soul. And that sort of is suppressed, and we have to learn in books and study and try to pray on it and develop it. Why is that? So why is it that the physical and the nefesh habahamit is so much stronger than the spiritual soul? So this is the question, and we're going to get to that right now. So you can either pull out the map, or you could look at the board. So in the map that we have, the insert. So in lesson 1, we discussed the 3 worlds, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya. In lesson 2, we introduced the Sfirot. And in lesson 3, we spoke about Keter. Right? Someone is sending me a chat. Yeah, we'll get to that, how to integrate the 2. We're first asking the questions, then we'll get to the answer. So when you look at the map, I want to show you a few things that are very, very important here. Number 1, the 10 Sfirot represent the human soul. Right? So we have
Which soul?
You see at the bottom of the board, look at both.
Does each soul have its own sphero?
No, each sphera, if you look at the map, you'll see that each sphera is multicolor. The bottom is purple pink, and the top is sort of like a shade of gray. Which means to say that the 10 Sfirot are both in the divine soul and they're in the animal soul. The 10 Sfirot that are in the divine soul are an expression of the divine. The 10 Sfirot in the animal soul are an expression of the divine. Let's say you have the human intelligence, Chachma Bina Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So if it's in the Nefesh Elokit, it's applying it to study of the divine, to understand God, studying Kabbalah. If it's in the animal soul, then it's studying either secular stuff or nature, but it's not necessarily spiritual stuff. Same thing as with feelings. Someone has a love towards other people, that can come from the animal soul. Even a love for God, if it's animalistic, is from the animal soul. But if you have a pure, divine love, it's coming from the spiritual soul. And that's the whole point that we're trying to say, that there are 2 souls, and each one has the set of the 10 Sfirot. There's the 10 Sfirot, the way they operate and function in the divine soul, and there's the 10 Sfirot as they operate and function in the animal soul. Okay. But this leaves us with a question. Remember the word Seder Hishtalshalut. We learned that in the first class and in the second class. Seder Hishtalshalut is the system of the devolution, right? It's how everything rises from above to below. So you have the higher to the lower, to the lower, to the lower. We talked about the three worlds as part of it, the 10 Sfirot. If we are a mirror image of the divine, and that's why we were created in the image of God, God doesn't have an animal soul. And if God doesn't have an animal soul, where do we get an animal soul from? We're not talking about the body right now. We're talking about the animal soul that's within us. So how does this come about? This is the questions. Why two souls? How can the animal be soul be an opponent? And where does it come from? Yeah. You can take a shot, but this question, this is one question really. This is very important to understand what we're talking about here. So we're saying that we have both drives because we know that we have both drives. In fact, it's interesting, if you can wait a minute, in the last week's Torah portion, when it talks about Rebecca, when she was pregnant with Yaakov and Ein Sof, Rashi says, whenever she passed a house of Torah study or study of spirituality, Yaakov pushed and wanted to go out. Whenever it went through an idol worship place, Ein Sof wanted to go out. And this has sort of become the concept of the Nefesh Elokit, Nefesh Bahamit, the good inclination, the bad inclination. Anyways, but where is it above? Okay, what's your answer? Does everybody understand the question before Brad takes an attempt to answer it, makes an attempt? Do you all understand? If we are a mirror reflection of above, and everything that we have is in sync with what's happening from above, where do we have above an animal soul? So how do we have two souls? We have two sets of souls. We have an animal soul and a spiritual, a godly soul. And not only that, the animal soul is stronger than the spiritual soul. And where does the animal soul come from? What happened here? Yes.
So is the animal soul necessary to animate us?
Is the animal soul necessary to animate us? You're answering a question about the function. That's not what the question is. Yes.
So the question stemmed from why doesn't God have an animal soul? He doesn't have a physical form, so he doesn't need an animal soul.
Animal soul has nothing to do, one second, one at a time. Animal soul has nothing to do with the physical body.
Well, that's what I was asking.
Animal soul can animate us in a passionate way, but in a spiritual way as well.
Oh, no, I didn't mean animate that way. I mean, physically be alive.
So then the question is, if God doesn't have physicality, how do we have physicality? That in itself is a question.
That I don't.
That's part of the question. What?
Everything comes from it.
But how does it, if God doesn't have it, how do we have it? Okay, I need you to focus on this question because it's impossible to say that we have it and God doesn't have it. And if God has it, what does it mean that God has? So this is why I said tonight's class is so fundamental in trying to understand the function of the human being and the function of the world, because we're going to reveal to you a concept which is mind-boggling. And I have to say, I myself find it mind-boggling. And just let me see, there's a question. As an extension of the Seder Ishtalshel, we're a reflection of God. We actually are a reflection of God. Doesn't mean we're God. God is God, but we are created in the image of God, which means we're a reflection of God. That's when we look at a human soul, we look at a piece of God within us. And actually, Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya that every soul is part of the essence of God himself. So therefore, we have to say that we have it. So the answer is that it all stems from God. But how does this happen? We're going to introduce you to something. Before I go to the specifics about it, I'm going to introduce you to a word. Now, you might have heard a word. It's called Tikkun. Have you ever heard the word Tikkun? What does Tikkun mean?
Repair.
Huh? Repair. Tikkun olam, repair the world. What does it mean to repair the world? Repair the world from what?
Shatters.
Huh?
From shatters.
What's the shattering all about? Who shattered? You're correct, but what shattered? We're going to get there soon.
Very tough answer.
Very tough. Well, hopefully tonight you're going to know exactly what shattered. So Tikkun Olam is not just of taking the world and making it nice, beautifully physical. That's part of it. Tikkun Olam is not just to correct the inequities in the world. Tikkun Olam is a spiritual concept which the Kabbalah introduces. But the counter to Tikkun, what's the counter to Tikkun? The preceded Tikkun was Tohu. Have you ever heard the word Tohu? The world of Tohu. What is Tohu? The literal translation of Tohu is chaos. What does chaos mean? Disorganized, out of sync. So what are we talking about? In sync and out of sync. So we've gone the moderate hike. Now we're going to go a little bit of the steep hike. And here's where you're going to have to follow with me a little bit. So we're going to introduce to you a concept that Hasidus talks about. Hasidus is what we're studying more than Kabbalah. And Hasidus talks about this in a very deep way. There are many discourses, one deeper than the other. And we're just going to give you a little synopsis of it so we can understand it. The idea that we're going to introduce now is something which is called light and vessel. In the Hebrew, it's called or and kli, or and keli. Light and vessel. Light and vessel, what does light mean and what does vessel mean? So we need to understand that every revelation, whether it's a divine revelation or a human revelation, has to have two components to it. One component is the light, and the other component is the vessel. The light is the energy, the vessel is what carries it. How do we know that it exists by God? I'm gonna explain it all to you. Just let's look at the source. The source is in the Zohar, and this has actually become the opening line of a very famous chapter in Tanya that he discusses this at the deepest level. So we're not going to go that deep, but we're going to still please see this verse. This verse, if you open up your book to page 114, I'm having good. Look at text 3. The king, which goes on God, is present within the 10 attributes of Atzilut. Let's stop here. In the second class, if you remember, after we talked about the three worlds, we talked about the divine world, which was the world of God's consciousness. And we said in God's consciousness, the light of God is refracted into 10 faculties, 10 powers, and they're called the 10 Sfirot. If you have your map, it's right here. These are the 10 Sfirot, right here, right? So these are the 10 Sfirot. Now, so God is present. That we understand this line when it says God is present in 10 Sfirot. Let's talk about Atzilut. Since Atzilut is an expression of God, unlike the world of Bria and Yitzir and Asiya, which those are worlds where the consciousness is outside of God, it's a consciousness of self, where Atzilut is the consciousness of God. So now we understand that these 10 attributes of Atzilut, God is present within them because the only thing that exists there is the presence of God. Okay, that makes sense, right? But let's see what he says in the second line. He says, he and his vessels are one in that world. He and his lights are one in that world. What's he talking about now? Talking about lights and vessels. It goes back to the Zohar. What are you talking about? He's saying he and his light is one, and he and his vessels are one. But he starts, he and his vessels are one, and he is in which world is that? That's only in Atzilut. Because outside of Atzilut, they have their own consciousness, so they're not one with God. What is lights and what are vessels? So we know that each of the Sfirot have two dimensions to it. That's why they have the two colors. One is light and the other is vessel. So what is light and what is a vessel? Now, in order to understand this, I have to say this as a cautionary note, almost like a disclaimer. The deficiency that we have is that we can only perceive things in physical terms. We can only perceive things when we can see it, touch it, and understand it with a metaphor that resonates with us. This topic and the subjects that we're talking about are beyond the understanding of the physical mind. So even though we will use examples, The examples is only to give us an insight of the general concept, but it doesn't mean that that's what it is exactly. It's much deeper and much higher. So what we're going to talk about is light and vessels. So on a simple level, the simplest level of light and vessels is body and soul. And we don't even bring it here as an example. The reason we don't bring it here as an example is because the soul is not really light like light. But for our purposes to discuss this, we can say it. So the energy that we have within us, the life that we have in us is the light. The body is what portrays it, right? It lives in the body. But it's true in everything. Take words. If you have an idea, and the idea is in your mind, and if the idea is so deep, you're not even thinking about the idea in the term of words. Because if you're going to have to explain it to someone else, you're going to say, okay, let me find the words with which I can express it. The moment you say, let me find the words with which I can express it, means that when you were thinking about the idea, you were seeing the light of the idea, and it didn't really need the words, or the words were there, they were so transparent, and they were so fragile, or they were so spiritual, that they weren't like an entity unto themselves. The words express the idea. So when you're looking at a book, for instance, and you're reading the book, your focus is on the idea. But if the page was wordless, you wouldn't be able to get the idea. So the idea that's contained in it, that's considered the light. The words are considered to be the vessel. So for instance, if someone types on a computer page, like a child gets on there, what was it when the computer first came out with the internet? Dave Barry, who was a very famous comedian, writes, because nobody understood the HTTP with the all various other symbols. And he said, I guess a squirrel ran over the keyboard, and now you have words. Because everybody thought it was hocus pocus. They didn't understand the whole idea of the programming. But the truth of the matter is that words mean something if they have meaning, if they have a content. If somebody comes and says, I have a new word that I want to introduce to you, and they say the word, and it's not found in the dictionary, and it doesn't really have a meaning, it's just a word, it's just a vessel, but it doesn't have light. So you can have a vessel without light. Let's say somebody makes up a new word and says something that is impossible that it should actually exist scientifically. And then they come to him and say, it's a nice word, but what it represents and what you're saying doesn't exist. So he says, okay, scratch it, but the word is still there. Then the word has no meaning. So the vessel is there, but it has no light. On the other hand, you can have light, which is an idea, but if you can't express it in words, so the light is there, but there's no way to grab it. There's no way to grab onto it, right? On page 115, he gives several examples. He gives an example of the book. He gives an example of a melody, the emotions and the musical notes. He gives an example of business, vision, and strategy. He gives an example of a relationship, love, and action. And he gives an example of religion, beliefs, and rituals. They're all semi-examples because they're not perfect. And why are they not perfect? The reason it's not perfect is because I'll ask you another question. So far you're following with me, right? Everything has to have light and vessels. When we're talking about the light from God, why is the energy called light? We talked about it last week. I don't know how many of you remember it, but it's very important to bring up that point again. We talked about a lot of the values of light. Light doesn't have an entity of its own. Light doesn't have a consciousness of its own. Light is only there to reveal its source. Remember, we said that? Another thing about light is that light is totally devoted to its source. If it's not connected to its source, it ceases to exist. The other thing is about light, that because light is devoted to its source, its desire is to be reincorporated into its source. It doesn't want to remain as an independent being. This is true with the light of God. Whether that tendency is in regular light, there's a whole big debate amongst scholars of Kabbalah. The Rebbe is the one that came along and said that it is true in regular light as well. Even the light of the sun has it. But now is not the time to talk about it. And it's included in the Encyclopedia Chabad. It gives the whole explanation for that. So why did the sages choose the word light? Because the energy of God, number one, is transparent. Number two, it's very pure. It's very spiritual. Number three, it's cleaves to its source. It's a reflection of God. And number four, it seeks to return to God at all times. So it doesn't want to, by nature, to extend itself. Unlike the light of the sun, the light of God wants to go back to its source, like a candle that's going upwards. It's always trying to reach its source. And light, because it's called the Teva Ha'aliyah Ba'or. Ever heard of the word Aliyah? Ascension. The nature of ascension and light. Light ascends, it wants to, that's how pure it is. The purity is that it wants to rather be in its source, even if it means that it ceases to exist. This is what we discussed at great length last week. Now, we will understand why the divine energy is called light, because the divine energy is a reflection of God. It's not a reflection of an outside being, it's a reflection of God. Light by itself, its consciousness, is the consciousness of God, not a consciousness of outside. A keli, a vessel, on the other hand, is just the opposite. A vessel draws down the light and keeps the light down. The purpose of the vessel is to take the light and process it and make it usable. So the vessel is the coarse part of the light. The vessel is the physical part of the light, because without the vessel, you don't have the light. So if you have the concept and the idea, if you don't have the words that hold on to it, then the light dissipates. So it's two different directions. The light is the direction that it goes upwards, and the vessel is which comes down. So by nature, light and vessels should not coexist, because light is so transparent that it doesn't want to be in the vessel. And vessel wants to close the light down and temper it and say, cool it a little bit. I want you to be more coarse. And yet they come together. And we're going to discuss this. How is it that they're able to come together? And in the same respect, this is the story with the soul and the body. The soul doesn't want to be in the body, because the soul's perception is a very divine perception. When the soul leaves the comforts of the Garden of Eden and it enters into the body, it all of a sudden enters into a world which is so physical that it's disgusting to it. It's smelly. It's like going into a moldy cellar. It doesn't want to be there. That's why the Medrash says that when a child is born, the soul is descending from on high. It's crying, don't take me away from the comfort where I am near God. Why take me to this lousy place? And God says it's all for the sake of ascent. Okay? And then once the soul comes into the body, it's imprisoned. It's suppressed, right? So the nature is that the soul shouldn't want to be with the body. What keeps the two of them together? That's going to be the answer to the next question, which is also the answer for how the lights and the vessels work together. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about light. In truth, we said that vessels have coarseness. Light doesn't have any coarseness. Now, bear with me a little bit more, because not everything is so simple. There is this concept of relativity. I'm sure everybody knows about relativity, okay? I remember growing up as a child, there was Jigan and Schumacher were very famous Jewish comedians that came from the old country. All their comedy was in Yiddish. They lived in Israel. So it was all recordings. And I remember as a child listening to it, because in the summer bungalow colony that we wore, all the old ladies from the past, they used to love listening to it. So I'm going to give you one of the examples. So you have one of them is playing as if he's an intellectual. He's reading a Yiddish newspaper with all these fancy Latin words. And he comes to the word relativity. So the other, relative in Yiddish is relative. Same thing. So the other guy asks him, it's Einstein and Weinstein. Einstein is the smart one, Weinstein is the simple guy. So Weinstein says to Einstein, was ist das relative? What is relative? So he's trying to explain the concept of relative to him. So he comes with some examples. Some are not nice, but this one example definitely caught my attention. He said, is 7 here? 7 strands of hair. Is that a lot or a little? It's a relative question. If you find it in a cup of milk, it's a lot. But if you find it on the head of a man, it's very little. So that's relative, right? So he gave other examples as well. But the idea, what I'm trying to say is that relativity is very important when we study this. Because, and I learned this as a younger man, because when you're learning these kind of concepts, there's nothing really black and white. It could be black and white on one level, then you go to another level, it looks like a different color. As we see ourselves, you can see something that looks like one color, then you put it in the sunlight, it has a different color, right? So if you compare the light to the vessel, the light is colorless. The light has no character. So take, for instance, the Shvira of Chesed. Shvira of Chesed is benevolence and kindness. So the kindness, which is the desire to do kindness and the feeling that one gets from doing kindness or love, is a very palpable, tangible feeling. But that's when it's in the heart, when it's in the vessel. But if it's in the light itself, it's pure light. The reason I gave you the whole introduction, you will soon see. So let's give a reading from the Rebbe Rashab. Open up to 116. Because before we come to the whole thing of Tohu and Tikkun, we need to understand the difference between light and vessels. So he says the light itself is in a state of simple abstractness. The vessel imposes a definition on the light in the form of a particular attributes of wisdom, kindness, and so forth. Now, what does this mean? So I'm going to give you the simple answer. Simple answer is actually Rav Moshe Cordovero, in one of the early books of Kabbalah, he was a teacher of Arizal, when he was introducing the Sfirot. It's a very well-known subject in the study of Hasidus and Kabbalah. So he says the following: the Sefirot, the Keli, the vessels are like stained windows. So let's say if you have sunlight that's pouring into a room and it comes through a regular glass, or let's say the glass has one color, so then all the light that comes into the room is that one color. But let's say it's stained glass with multiple colors, so then the light comes into the room in these multiple colors. So even though when you walk into the room, you see multiple colors, and they're real, but that's not the essence and character of the light. The light is still simple. What draws the character in the light are the vessels. It's a very famous statement. But I have to say, and this particular lesson follows a lot in that path. But I wouldn't be honest with you to say that that's the final word, because the Arizal, his student, Rabbi Yitzchak Lurie, says you can't say that the light is that simple. Because if the light was that simple, then you couldn't apply color to it. The very fact that light allows color to be applied to it means that it already has the potential to turn into a color, even though it's because of its nature, of its transparency, but it already has a connection to the color. Because what he's trying to distinguish is between the light that was already condensed that comes through the sfirot to the light that's much higher, that doesn't have any sfirot. This is very important for us to understand. So you're going to see in the video now, the video follows the Rav Moshe Cordovero idea, that the light is very, very plain and simple. But I must say to you that according to Hasidus, because Hasidus adopts, Rabbi, the philosophy of the Arizal, and there's long discussions about this from the Alter Rebbe and many of the other Rebbes. And in 1961, the Rebbe famously delivered on the yahrzeit of his father-in-law. It was a very long farbrengen, and he said a very long mimer. The mimer was based on Basi Lugani, and it was in 1961. And that mimer, he goes through all the opinions and comes to the final opinion. It is explained in such deep levels, but he brings it out to perfection. So I remember a few years ago, we were all studying it because it was 60 years from that. So we were all involved, and over there he lays it out. So it's not that simple that it's plain, but for our discussion, we're going to say that the light are channels of raw, infinite energy. And then when it hits the vessels, it reveals in this energy the particulars of each sphera. Okay? Now, the reason I said the word relativity before is because relative to the vessels, the light seems to be total abstractness and simple. But if you compare that light to a higher level, as we're going to see in the next lessons, it's not exactly the poster child for simplicity. There is something which is even deeper. So just keep it in mind, I don't want it to confuse you, but just to know this.
Welcome to our fourth video on the world of Kabbalah, our journey through the mystical layers of the Kabbalistic system. Today, we'll analyze the Sefirot, which are actually a combination of two elements. The Kabbalists call them Orot, lights, and Kelim, vessels, spiritual containers or conductors for the divine light. Now, there's no electromagnetism in the spiritual heavens, so the terms lights and vessels are just metaphors. Light refers to the abstract divine energy behind any particular reality, and vessel refers to the structure applied to that energy to facilitate a specific function. Okay, that's a bit heavy, so let's use Benny as an example. Benny got beaten up at school, and Benny's dad is really disturbed, which, by the way, is a powerful but undefined energy. It is the light or force without any particular vessel or outlet. But Dad has several options. He could release it as frustration with the school, anger at the attacker, empathy, love, and guidance for Benny, compassion for a bully who needs emotional redirection, and so on. Those are all potential vessels for the same basic light. So the vessels of the Sefirot are 10 unique outlets for the same basic energy. They apply structure and definition that turn divine energy into chesed, love, gevura, discipline, tiferet, harmony, and so on. What if we kept the divine light, but deleted its vessels? It would be like Dad feeling deeply disturbed at Benny's experience, but having no ability to express or do anything about it. And what if we kept the vessels, but deleted the light? It would be like Dad having the ability to react, but lacking any motivation. In either case, there would be no reaction, no result. So this example helped us understand why the Sefirot are equipped with lights and vessels. But we've still got a problem. We refer to the divine abstract energy as light because it is constantly connected with its source, God Himself, just as sunlight is present only when the sun is present. Being intimately connected with God gives it a powerful appreciation for God. It longs to melt into God's infinite self and is utterly averse to being channeled into a limited structure. As for the vessels, they pull the other way. They're so addicted to structure that they have no patience for the abstractness of light. Talk about a personality clash. How can they ever fuse together? Simple. We're discussing the world of Atzilut, which is in tune with God's desire. It knows that the purpose of its existence is to create the finite worlds of Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So out of loyalty for God, the conflicting components of the Sefirot set aside their dispositions and work harmoniously to achieve the greater good of God's goals. That's good news for us for two reasons. One, it allows us to exist. Two, our souls are the great-grandchildren of the Sefirot of Atzilut. So we inherited the ability to set aside our personal dispositions to achieve the greatest good, whether it is to care for another, pursue a mitzvah act, or embrace our ethical responsibility.
Okay, I hope that sheds some light and gives us a vessel to be able to take it, right? Okay, there's one piece that I have to add, which is not in the text, which helped me a lot, but it's on the chart, and we'll get to that in a minute. So light wants to go back into its source. Let's see the reading for that. It's taken from a deep mimer from the 5th Chabad Rebbe, if you open up to page 116. Okay, it's text 4b. The lights of Atzilus, by their very nature, are abstract. They also aspire to return to their source and become wholly subsumed with their sublime origin. Accordingly, they're far removed from creating the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. Rather, the lights must first install themselves into the vessels of Atzilut in order to energize the creation of the worlds. So now we know that the vessels are there because the vessels can draw the light down and creates the structure and bring it down. So what we still don't have an answer for is why is it that they actually get together? In order to understand this, because this is going to be the difference between the Tohu and Tikkun, which leads us to the whole answer of the question before. Please look at your chart for a moment. If you give a look at the 10 Sfirot, which is lesson 3, right? Which goes from the yellow into the green zone. So you have, how many columns do you have there? You have 3 columns. You have a right, you have a left, and you have a center. That's the world of Tikkun. The fact that you have a right, left, and center, and you also see the lines together that they integrate. So there's a phenomena that's happening here. On the one hand, the lights want to disappear and enter above. On the other hand, the Kelim draw them down. What's the difference between Orot and Kelim? Give a look at the board. Orot, which is light, are abstract rather than defined. They desire to be with their source and not channeled elsewhere. The Kelim don't sense their source or desire to be connected. They're interested in what's happening below, okay? Now, I want you to look at 4, because we're in lesson 4, on your map, okay? You also have 10 Sfirot there. Can you point me to a distinction between the way the 10 Sfirot display themselves in Atzilut, which is lower, to the world of Tohu, which precedes Atzilut? What? Why? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Why is not in order? What's the glaring distinction between? It's only 2 columns. That's the point. It's only 2 columns. 2 columns means there's 2 different directions. The direction of the right side, which on this case is the left side, because that's where they put the 1. I would have put the 1 on the right side and the left, and the 2 on the left side. The right side is more giving, and the left side is more withholding. The right side is Chachma, which is the idea of the conception, the idea of ideas. Bina is on the left side, okay? So these 2 columns come into a clash. Why is it that in Atzilut, They don't clash because in Atzilut, what the third column does, the third column reaches all the way to the top, which is Keter, which is the inner desire of God. And over there, they recognize that there's an overall desire of God, and that is to create the lower worlds. So they sync together to be able to put aside their own nature in order to fulfill the mission. And we talked about this at length last week. In the last discussion, we gave the example of what's going on in Israel right now, even though there was a split that was happening, and even in the military, each division of the military had its own agenda, and now the coalescence of all of the powers came together because they have an overall mission. So that overall mission means that they can negate their own sense of self and they surrender to the mission. That's what happens when you have the third middle column in the middle that pulls them together. That is the world of Tikkun. The world of Tohu doesn't have the middle column, which reaches all the way. It doesn't sense the desire. And that is called Tohu. And Tohu, before we go there, look at page 118. Again, it's talking about, I'm sorry, 118, 4c. He says, lights and vessels are inherently opposites. The lights by their very nature are abstract. They also aspire to return to their soul and become wholly subsumed within their sublime origin. By contrast, vessels have a defined nature. They desire to retain their configuration, are naturally inclined to descend to the lower realms. How do they come together? So he writes in 4d, they are entirely submitted to God's intent for creation, namely, that the universe should become an orderly habit and not be left in chaos. So they have the bittul. They're subservient to God. That is what Tikkun is. Tikkun is hitkalalut. Remember we talked about hitkalalut, incorporating one with another? The only way they can incorporate, we gave the example of the State Department and the Defense Department have their own ideas, but they're standing in front of the king, and the king says, this is our mission, and they suddenly blend together, right? Okay, Tohu is the opposite. Tohu is a place where there's very strong light, but they don't have the recognition of the higher. So let's see how that is. First, let's look at the board for a minute, or you could look in the text number 5. This is taken from the very beginning of creation. We know the first words of Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning of God's creations of the heavens and earth, the earth was chaotic and desolate. The word is tohu. Darkness was on the surface of the deep, and God's spirit hovered over the water. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Let's give a look on, I need you to look at the screen right now. The screen shows something very interesting. It says the first thing that God created was light. And you see in the Hebrew, the yellow area. So that is Yehi Or. Let there be light. But that wasn't the first thing that happened. That light refers to the light of Atzilut, which is Tikkun. Before that, you find the world was desolate and chaotic. You see in the Hebrew, the first word on the right side is Tohu. Right? If you read Hebrew, you see it says Tohu. Tohu vavohu. That was the world of chaos, which actually, the world of chaos created that everything was out of sync. What does this mean? So let's talk about this a second. You had very intense lights, because the intense lights came directly from God, and light by nature is very intense. But it's higher than Atzilus. It's not tempered yet by the vessels. It's pure light. And it doesn't want to have a relationship with the vessels because it doesn't have the third column. It doesn't have that understanding of the submission to God. And then it comes in touch with the vessels. The vessels are fragmented. The vessels are not cohesive. The vessels have their own selfish interests. They don't have the interest of the light. They come together, and what happens? Because of this abundance of light and the vessels are not ready to take him, the vessels burst. And that's what Philip mentioned before about the shattering. I just have to say, when we talk about the vessels burst, it doesn't mean like a glass bulb. You have a light bulb that you put in and there's a surge of energy and the light bulb bursts. It's a good example, but this is not talking about physical, it's talking about spiritual. The spiritual shattering means, another example is when someone has a nervous breakdown. What happens in a nervous breakdown? Their life is not in sync. And then the light is so strong, their desires are so strong, the demands are so strong, the vessel that they have is not capable of dealing with it. They're not surrendering to a higher power. They're just thinking about what their needs are, and they fall apart. They have a nervous breakdown. Nervous breakdown is also called the shattering of the vessels. So this is what happened before God created Atzilut. By the way, it was by divine design. God wanted it, and we'll soon see why. So what God created was these immense lights that are very, very powerful. They're very strong. They connected with the vessels, and the vessels shattered with the sparks of light in them. Let's give a look how the Arizal's student writes about it on page 120, text 6. He says, the earth was chaotic and desolate. This refers to the breaking of the vessels. I want to go back. If you give a look on the Hebrew, you will see that it says, V'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. God's spirit hovered over the water. That refers to the lights of the vessels that fail to absorb. I want you to basically, the Alter Rebbe says something more, but they don't mention it here. The word merachefet, if you see it on the, do you see it on the screen, the word merachefet? It's in Hebrew. So it's the third line, and it's the second word from the left. You see merachefet? It's not in the books. I need you to pay attention to it. Merachefet, the Alter Rebbe says, has a mem in the beginning and a tuf at the end. When you take the mem and tuf together and you make a word out of it, it's dead, met. What was dead? Rachefet. Rachefet is 288. 288 sparks were contained in these vessels that shattered, and they descended in the world. And it is the job of us humans, Tikkun Olam, to find those 288 sparks and reconnect them. That's called the Tikkun. The Tikkun means to reconnect it, and it's the world of Tikkun can do it. So let's see how the Rebbe Rashab mentions it. Look at text 7a and 121, and then we'll explain it all. The lights of Tohu were intense and powerful. They intensely desire to be nullified and subsumed with their emanating source. They had no sense of what their source wanted of them, because remember, they didn't have the middle column to be able to connect to the desire and know what God's desire was. As a result, they failed to deviate from their default nature for the sake of submitting to their greater purpose. The vessels, on the other hand, were on a total different level. So what happened was they weren't able to take the intense light, and they broke. So here, give a look at the screen. So you have the 10 Sfirot. The light refused to become Sfirot. And what happened was the vessels didn't want to serve the light, and you had the broken lefts. They slipped back to their source. That's called the broken vessels. I want to read one more thing, and then I'll explain it, and then we'll go from there. Page 122, 7b. The vessels could not contain their light because they were not sufficiently submissive to peer with the light's intense abstractness. They acted like a wick resistant to the flame, resulting in the flame slipping away. But it wasn't just that the flame slipped away, it was that they shattered and they fell into where the creation was. When God created the world, it was filled with these sparks that are all over. And that is Tohu affecting us. So Tohu, one second. So Tohu was the world that preceded Atzilut. It even preceded Keter. It was in the beginning of the Seder Ishtalshalut. There were very intense lights. And I'll give you another example as well. Since we said before that the purpose of the vessels is to develop the character of the lights, so it tempers the light. What happens when it tempers the light? When it tempers the light, it becomes more receptive to the opposite. That's what a tempered light is. Because they weren't tempered, it couldn't contain another light. So the right column and the left column, the right column, let's say, was kindness. Chesed was restraint. They were in a constant battle. It was like fire and water battling with each other. So they couldn't coexist. So that caused the shattering. Same thing was with Chochmah and Bina. Chochmah is wisdom. Wisdom is totally the opposite of Bina. Wisdom is the conception of the idea, thinking about the big picture. If you have somebody that only thinks about the big picture and they don't have the Bina aspect, which is the analytical part, to be able to understand it, then the vision just dissipates. Nothing happens. Think of an architect without an engineer. An architect can plan a beautiful building, but if it's not viable according to the engineer, it's just a bubble and it'll collapse. Now, the engineer doesn't necessarily come up with the conception of the design. What the engineer does is the engineer studies the design and says, this is feasible, this is not feasible, this is workable, it's not. So the architect is more like an artist, it's more like Chokhmah, and the engineer is Bina. Imagine if you are doing a building project and the architect and engineer don't get along and they're arguing constantly. So what are you going to have? You're going to have chaos. You're going to have chaos. And if you do build, taking both ideas together and their contrast, the building will collapse. It's not going to be able to stand. That's exactly what happened in Tohu. But because it preceded Atzilut and had such strong lights, the lights that landed from it were very powerful. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a picture of Tohu and Tikkun. Yes, I just want to be fair. Answer, does the shape of light change the bending observer? No, this has nothing to do with that. It has to do specifically with bringing a picture into the light. You can say that light versus vessel is a little bit like the infinite and finite to a certain extent, because compared to the vessel, light is infinite. Okay, what's the intent of each example gives a different angle on it. Okay, we'll take the rest of it soon. Okay, what was your comment? Because now we're going to get, once we understand Tohu a little better and how it relates to us, we will understand the conflict of the soul, the conflict of the physical to the spiritual, the conflict of good and bad, and all of that is going to fit in to our understanding. Yes.
Gave the example in Tohu of the powerful resistance between opposing forces.
The powerful resistance between opposing forces, yes.
Opposing forces arrived in Tohu.
Oh, they were created by God. It's a reflection of a flow of the divine God's light. And God created the light and God created the vessels. The light, okay, we have to understand that the source of light comes from God. It emanates from God. Next week, we're going to discuss something which is called a Tzimtzum and a Kav. So I don't want to jump there, but nevertheless, everything is sourced in God. So the light is sourced in God and the vessels are sourced in God. The light is sourced in the projection of light that God causes to come into the world. The vessels are projected from God's hiding the light. We will have a better picture on that next week, where the source of the light and the vessels are. It's too heavy for right now, so that's why I don't want to discuss it. But it all comes from God. Right now, we're talking about the function of the lights and the vessels. Once the lights of the vessels of Tohu clashed, they landed on planet Earth. Not only in planet Earth, but mainly in planet Earth. So what we're soon going to see is the source of the physical and the animal comes from Tohu. The source of the divine soul comes from Tikkun. Because since Tohu was the shattering, what did the shattering do? The shattering caused the light to disappear and all remained with the vessels with a little light. But these vessels are very strong. So the vessels, their nature is to be selfish. Their vessels is to be oriented towards the self. So everything that's selfish in the world, everything that represents selfishness in the world, everything that represents the of ourself is originated in Tohu. However, because it comes from Tohu, it has an enormous disproportionate power over Tikkun, because Tohu precedes Tikkun. It comes before Tikkun. Tikkun was created before Tohu. Give a look. Animals, for instance. You take an ox and put it to a person, who's stronger? The ox. Even a cow is stronger. You take many animals, they have an enormous power and enormous abilities when it's their natural impulse that a human being couldn't do. You take an ape and put them in the water. They don't need anyone to teach it swim. They know how to swim and they can do. Take a bear, take anything like that. So Chassidus says, why do these animals have this disproportionate power that they can even oppress a human being? It's because they come from Tohu, and Tohu fights Tikkun. So an animal will fight the human being. The animal will fight, and that's the meaning of the animalistic within us as well. So when you have the two different drives, the drive of the spiritual, the divine, and the drive of the physical, the drive of the spiritual and the divine, that comes from Tikkun, which that's the way the neshama descends from Atzilus in us. But we also have the drive of the physical, that comes from Tohu, and Tohu is so much higher and deeper and stronger, so therefore it has the power to be stronger and overpower the soul. The question is, how do we tame it? But we'll get to that in a minute. What's your question?
It says that it was in the earth, but the world wasn't created yet.
That it was what?
This world of Tohu, it said it was in the land, but the world wasn't created yet. So
This comes after the word Bereshit. Bereshit means there was a creation. So there's a continuous chain of creation. Creation came with levels. So the first thing that was created was light. And then there was the Tzimtzum, as we're going to discuss next week. Then there was the Seder Ishtalshalos. But everything goes downward because the intent of God was that it should go downward. Where's the intent of God? This physical world. So even the light, even Tohu, even though the lights of Tohu were reincorporated in the essence of God, but the vessels of Tohu, which that was the point of the self-orientation, what happened to that? That entered into this world. It entered into the physical world. As God was creating one level to another level, it actually entered into this world. This world has much more of, even though we call it the Olam HaTikkun, but the power in this world is more Tohu than Tikkun. And Tohu has a much greater presence here. Let's see how Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi says it, and then we'll be able to put it into the words and we'll understand what this whole lesson is. Remember, we started the lesson by saying there are two souls that fight against each other, right? There's the divine soul and the animal soul. We spoke about the divine soul has a God consciousness, the animal soul has a selfish consciousness. We asked the question, how is it possible that the animal soul has power over the divine soul? We gave the example of a candle with the fire, what melts the wax, but over here it's just the opposite. So we introduced us to the concept of Tohu and Tikkun. In order to understand Tohu and Tikkun, we have to understand the interaction between lights and vessels. So in Tikkun, the lights and vessels have the third column, so they're subordinate to a higher purpose, so the opposites can come together and they work beautifully together in cohesiveness, right? But in Tikkun, since they don't have that ability, because they're not connected to the highest level, they don't have the third column, so they're at each other's throat. So they clash until they crashed. And the crashing caused the light to disappear, but the vessels, which came from a very high level, that are very powerful and very strong, landed here. And because they landed here, they are so powerful that they're more powerful than the spiritual. Let's see how the Alter Rebbe writes it in text 8 on page 25. You're following me so far? Yeah? Okay, good. So the Alter Rebbe says the human being is comprised, this is page 25, text 8, the human being is comprised of both Tohu and Tikkun. Our godly souls are the product of Tikkun and are therefore inherently subservient to God, right? Our animal souls and bodies are products of the broken vessels of Tohu. And although inanimate objects, plants, and animals are also linked with Tohu, the concept of separation from God is far more pronounced in humans. That is because all other things cannot sin, and therefore do not become completely separated from God. Humans, by contrast, on account of our bodies and animal souls, are capable of sin and consequently of becoming far more separated from God. But if you wonder why an animal is impulsive and has such strength and such desire, you ever watch the way a lion goes after its prey? It's because it is rooted in Tohu. Now, when we have a temptation and we become animalistic and we go after it, we're allowing Tohu to take charge over us entirely. Our job is to do Tikkun Olam. What is Tikkun? To take this world that is dominated by Tohu and reveal the godliness in it, the light in it, and taming it, and bringing out the divine, how everything is back in sync. Because Tohu is not in sync, we put everything into sync with God. But before we go there, because that'll be text number 9, I just want to explain one other thing, which is very, very important as well, even though it's not in the text here. This is not only true in each and every individual, it's also true in the eternal battle between Jacob and Esau, and eventually between Jacob and Ishmael. But let's talk about this for a moment. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Levi in Torah Or writes about Rebecca, when she was pregnant with Yaakov and Esau. And he writes there that Yaakov's soul was rooted in Tikkun. And that's why he wanted to create the world, a world that was in sync with God. Esau was rooted in Tohu, which Tohu is out of sync of God. It's self-oriented. Now, if Yaakov reveals the inner essence of the soul, which is connected with the infinity of God, then you can have power over Tohu. But as it says in the blessings of Yitzchak, that if Yaakov gives up that recognition of God and that connection to God, so he becomes subordinate to Tohu. Esau has a greater power over him. And that's what happened with the destruction of the second temple. It was destroyed by the descendants of Esau, which was Rome. And that was because the Jews did not live according to the demand of God, and there was disunity in the Jewish community. There was idol worship. They gave into temptations. There was corruption. And then Rome came in and had the ability to challenge. Tohu challenged Tikkun, and it culminated with the Holocaust, which was also the descendants of Esau, of Tohu, having total power over Tikkun. What will happen? How will this stop? Now, by the way, in the same Mittler Rebbe, tonight is the Mittler Rebbe's Yortzeit and his birthday. So he writes in one of his books called Shari Tshuva, he writes about this whole thing about Tohu and Tikkun, but he says that just before Mashiach comes, in the years before Mashiach comes, the Tohu will stop bothering Jacob. They will be kinder to Jacob. And the challenge to the Jew will be the people of Yishmael. And they will give a tremendous challenge. And until the angel of Ishmael falls, it'll be very tough suffering for the Jewish people. And when the angel of Ishmael falls, that's when Mashiach will come. But it also says when Mashiach comes, we say every morning in the davening, that those that were saved will come to Zion to judge the mountain of Esau. And what will happen then, once they subdue Esau, which is Tohu, then there will be the kingship for God, and everyone will recognize the oneness of God's kingdom. That's when Tikkun will prevail over the entire world. So in other words, according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, everything that's displaying out on the canvas of the world with the suffering of the Jews and the dominance of Esau all these years and the fight and the challenges, this is all the challenge of Tohu and Tikkun, because we are supposed to promote Tikkun, and Tohu has the upper hand on us until Mashiach comes. So this is very interesting. Now, in our own life, we also have it. And in our own life, we need to take and elevate the sparks. Now, here's one other thing, and that is that since Tohu is higher than Tikkun, when you elevate the spark of Tohu, I'll give you an example. Animals are from Tohu. Why did God give us permission to eat animals? God gave us permission to eat animals not because we needed the nutrients. We needed the nutrients because the sparks contained in the animals come from Tohu. And it is our job to elevate those sparks. And when we consume those sparks and make it part of us, it gives us more divine energy, not only more physical energy, but more divine energy, because we've conquered the Tohu and we've incorporated it into us. So the idea of eating meat is not just that we have permission after the flood, but it was a mitzvah, especially on Shabbat on the holidays, or if you think about the offerings that were brought in the temple, it was all from me to elevate the sparks of Tohu. So some people feel that they don't have the ability to challenge Tohu and eat it and elevate it during the week, but on Shabbat, when it's a mitzvah, that's why on Shabbat there's a mitzvah to eat meat, unless someone's digestive system doesn't work well with meat. But this is what the concept is. We are to tackle the Tohu and incorporate it and elevate it. And that's what the whole purpose of creation is. So God did it initially in order to come to Tikkun, that Tikkun should come to a higher level by challenging it with Torah. Let's give a look the way it says in text 9. This is also taken from the Kabbalah on page 126. All of the mitzvot are designed exclusively to purify the animal's soul and mortal body. By contrast, the divine soul does not require rectification. It has no intrinsic need to become installed within an animal's soul and mortal body. The sole purpose for doing so is to illuminate and rectify them. Understand this well. The reason the soul descends to this world is to rectify and purify, which that's the word that he uses is tikkun. So by elevating these sparks and recharging them and connecting them, it's rectifying the world. But from that, the human also receives a light that they couldn't receive any other way. So this is what, I'm just going to skip the slides to that. So Tikkun is the second emanation of the spirit in which the lights and vessels sense God's purpose, causing them to set aside their default nature, allowing them to remain paired with each other. Now, when we take the godly soul and it connects with the Tohu, it becomes even stronger. Okay, so we have that. Now, one of the things that we see about Tohu is Tohu came first. That's why the animals were created first, because they have a higher power. They weren't as filtered as Tikkun. They weren't as tempered as Tikkun. So they are first versus second. But the way they display themselves, they're self-centered, where Tikkun is mission-oriented. They're separate. There's deviation instead of loyalty. Broken vessels versus complete vessels. They're powerful versus average strength because they come from such a high source. And that's why they are scary looking. If you ever encounter a wild bear in the forest, it's Tohu at its best. Yeah.
So, do some animals not have some spirot? In other words, their vessels broke. Like a bear can't have chesed, or
They can, but they come. Let me repeat it for the sake of people that are listening.
I want to go back to that one just for a second.
1 second. Let me answer his question. The vessels, the way they're broken, are not incorporated one with another. We're almost done. We're already done. You get the point already. They're not in cahoots with each other. So therefore, when you find an animal cannot consolidate or fuse two opposites, right? An animal, you take a lion playing with a gazelle, and you see sometimes pictures of patting it, but you know that at the end it's only going to eat it. It's not kind to it. It could be kind to its own children, maybe a little bit. Some animals, by definition, are chesed. They're very kind. They have no evil in them. But they can't incorporate one with another because they come from Tohu. Tohu is all about non-incorporation. They're all self. So if you have a person that by nature is only kind and they can't find discipline in them, you have chaos. If you have a parent that only spoils their child, what do you have in the house? Chaos. Even though kindness is lovable. If you have a parent that is only disciplined, you also have chaos. So the human has the ability to integrate the two. The animal doesn't have the ability to integrate the two because the animal is totally Tohu. But the animals, because it's Tohu, it's pure and it's untempered and it's very powerful. And when we incorporate it in Tikkun, we are taking that strong power and actually It animates us. So the passion that we have in Judaism is a passion that comes from the animal soul when it's been tamed for the right reason, and we can ride it high. Okay? Yeah, what was your...
If you have vegetables, do they have, is specifically
Vegetables?
Yeah, you're incorporating that energy into yourself as well.
Yeah. So a vegetable also has tohu, but it's a much lower part of tohu. It's not the part of tohu that is so powerful. It's sort of the lighter aspect of tohu. The harsher idea of tohu is more found more in animals. And
what about fish and birds? They came before the animals.
so they did come before the animals, and there's a certain part of tohu that is even bigger in them. And that's why we eat all of them, because the eating of all of them, you go to a nutritionist says you have to have a varied diet, you have to have all kinds of things, you have to have all color vegetables, you have to eat fish, don't eat that much meat and all of that. The reason it's so is because it's on a spiritual level that way, because that's what we need for our spiritual energy. But the point which we want to make is that the challenges that we have in life are all from Tohu. All the challenges come from Tohu. So even the evil inclination that we have, or if someone is obsessed with making money and they don't have time for spirituality, it's all Tohu. And the question is, if Tohu is so powerful, how do we have the ability to overcome it? And this is what I want to answer. It'll really be answered more next week, but I don't want to leave you without the answer. With this, I'll finish. Remember, the source of all light comes from the infinite light of God. The infinite light of God is way before the Seder HaHishtalshalut, the order of the devolution. It's the pure light of God. The soul originates in that infinite light. However, the way the soul descends, it goes through the whole system of devolution. So the only thing that's apparent in the soul, or that the soul is aware of, is the world of Tikkun, because that's where it truly acclimates, in the world of Atzilut. Then it goes through the world of Bria, Tzir, and Asiya. But hidden inside of the soul is that inner resource of the infinity of God. When the soul is challenged with Tohu, and the ordinary Tikkun cannot overcome it, it needs to dig deep into the essence of its infinity in order to overcome it. And we have that ability to do that. And we recite it every day when we say the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, as we said in the beginning of the class. The literal translation of Shema Yisrael, Hear, O God, our Lord is one, is not just declaring the unity of God, but saying that even though we live in nature, which is produced by the name Elokim, but the essence of the soul is rooted in the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is the infinite light of God. And that infinite light of God is one with nature. So when we're saying Shema, we're actually reaching into the deep resources of ourself, and that allows us to overcome. The more the challenge, the deeper we go within ourselves. So the true sages, when they were challenged with something, they didn't look at the challenge as an obstruction. They looked at the challenge as an opportunity, that through this challenge, they could reach a much higher level, even though they didn't want it, because we don't want to have the challenge because it's very painful. But nevertheless, when they came with the challenge, it was like riding a tall wave. They're able to tame it, and they were able to reveal the inner resource. So to recap what we learned tonight, which is very important, is that we have animal, we have spiritual, we have good, we have evil, we have light, we have darkness. All of that is a contrast, right? All of the negative, that's rooted in Tohu, and that's why they're very powerful. All of the positive is rooted in Tikkun. We're supposed to live in the world of Tikkun. And our job is to allow that Tikkun should override the Tohu, and to tame it and to make it part of our life. That's really what the job is. So the next time you ask, Why is it that life has these challenges? It's because Tohu is very present, and the Tohu is challenging us, and it's a call for us to activate the Tikkun. Now, this is not only during the time that we learn Torah mitzvahs. There's a reading in text 11, and that is that in everything we do, even when we go to work and we go to business, we will find these challenges. Now, this also is another thing that the Alter Rebbe addresses in Tanya. People say, if I was truly righteous, negative thoughts would not come into my mind. The answer is, we're not truly righteous. Only Moses and Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rebbe, they were righteous. We're ordinary people. So the question is, why do negative things come into us? Because we're exposed to Tohu. And our job is to override the Tohu and tame it. Some things are by harnessing it for holiness, and some things are done by pushing it away. So if the temptation is something which is kosher, you can elevate it to a higher level. If the temptation is a prohibited temptation, the way you elevate it is by breaking the temptation and pushing it away. But all of that is a way of taming Tohu. Okay? So this explains the external challenge to the Jewish people, which is all coming from Tohu. That's why they have power. Because otherwise you'll ask the question, if the Jewish people are the chosen people and they have the soul of God in them and God wanted them, how is it that there could be a challenge to us? Even if we sinned, we still have the spiritual power. But we understand now that we're from Tikkun. The negative power comes from Tohu. So it takes an inner resource. And I want to say that that's why I'm very optimistic about what's going on in Israel. And the reason that I'm optimistic about what's going on in Israel is because Israel, before October 7th, was in the most lowest point in its history. It became so divided. The Tohu was so strong. Everybody was out of sync. They disconnected with each other. So much so that everybody said the military is not going to operate. The reservists are not going to go. If you remember the hundreds of thousands of people that are demonstrating, what did October 7th do? And unfortunately, it did it in a very, very bad way. It suddenly woke everybody up. And all the divisions melted and everybody's in sync. The Tohu that existed before October 7th was suddenly transformed into Tikkun. And they're focused that if you ask people in Israel who they have no doubt who they are. If you ask them about the righteousness of their mission, they have no doubt about the righteousness of their mission. If they know that there's a difference between light and dark, there's no question about it. There's no question about right and wrong. And they've all come together, no matter what their political background is, no matter what their dispositions are. They have come together they have coalesced together in such an unbelievable way. We discussed this at great length last week. They are now the epitome of Tikkun. But they have the energy. Since they had this challenge of Tohu, this unity has now brought out such a powerful force that they are more powerful than ordinary unity. What they're doing is so powerful that everybody is amazed that they have the ability to do that. And it's it is unbelievable. It's such a display, and I believe it's a preparation for the coming of Mashiach. Because the preparation for the coming of Mashiach is the prevalence and the power of Tikkun as it comes into the world and taming the Tohu. And this is what's happening now. Now we have to hope that it spills over into the diaspora, that they also see it. But the problem is that the diaspora doesn't feel the pain like the people in Israel feel. We can't even imagine what it is. You have to put yourself in their shoes to understand the pain that they're feeling. It wasn't another atrocity. It was their essence, their security, their ideals, everything shattered. It was their Shvirat HaKelim. Everything shattered. It was their breakdown. And now the only way forward is through Tikkun. So in essence, we have now come to understand the different forces that exist in the world and what our job is. Next week, I just want to say a program note. We're not going to meet on Tuesday night. We're going to meet on Monday night. We're going to publicize it again and again and again, because we have something that's going on Tuesday night. But nevertheless, we are going to go onto a level which is actually going to explain how is it that there are vessels, how is it that there's darkness in the world, and the ultimate fight between light and darkness. So stay tuned for that. Thank you very much. Yes, I just want to thank everybody for joining me and have a happy Thanksgiving.